I was called to the Netflix lot just after sunrise, when the fog still clung to the buildings like something reluctant to let go. The security supervisor kept repeating the same sentence as he walked us down the hallway. The room was locked the whole time. He said it the way people do when they need the words to be truer than they are. Screening room B was at the end of a narrow corridor. Badge-only access. No windows. No emergency exit. The door showed no signs of forced entry. The electronic lock logs confirmed it hadn't been opened in 3 days. Yet Marcus Thompson was inside. When we unlocked the door, the air that came out was cold and stale, like a space that hadn't realized time was passing. Marcus sat alone in the center seat, back straight, hands resting neatly on his thighs. His badge was still clipped to his belt. The screen in front of him was dark, reflecting our shapes like a dull mirror. No food containers, no water bottles, no mess. Just him, as if he had arrived moments ago and decided to sit perfectly still. What unsettled me wasn't that he was dead. It was that the room felt finished, like the moment after a performance ends, when the audience is gone. The lights are off, and something lingers that doesn't want to be acknowledged. I remember thinking, irrationally, that if we stayed quiet long enough, the screen might turn back on by itself. Up close, Marcus Thompson looked wrong in ways my brain kept trying to correct. Death usually announces itself quickly, color draining, skin slackening, the body surrendering to gravity. Marcus hadn't surrendered to anything. His skin was cool but unblemished, untouched by the dull gray creep of decay. No rigor, no collapse. It was as if his body had missed the memo that it was supposed to stop functioning as a whole. The coroner whispered more than he spoke, like volume might offend the room. Time of death was impossible to fix. Organs intact, no dehydration, no muscle breakdown. 72 hours without water should have left signs. There were none. Marcus looked preserved, curated, held in a state that felt deliberate, like an exhibit. Then I saw his face. The smile wasn't wide, but it was complete. Every muscle engaged, every nerve locked into place. Not joy, not peace. Awe. The kind you see on people staring at something vast enough to erase them. I felt a tightening in my chest, an instinctive urge to look away. But my eyes stayed. Lisa was the one who noticed his pupils. They weren't reflecting the overhead lights correctly. Inside the irises, etched too finely to be natural, were repeating geometric patterns, folding into themselves endlessly. Fractals. Perfect. I had the sudden, irrational thought that if I stared long enough, I'd start to recognize the shape, and worse, that the shape might recognize me back. I leaned closer than I should have. There's a distance you're trained to keep from a body, an unspoken line that says this is no longer a person. Marcus crossed it. His eyes pulled me in. The patterns weren't static. They suggested motion without moving, like a thought looping forever. Each angle folded into the next with impossible patience. They weren't damage. They were information. The forensic photographer snapped a picture, and for a split second, the camera screen filled with static. Not noise, order. The same repeating geometry. Brighter now, as if the lens had peeled something back. The image corrected itself immediately, leaving behind a normal close-up of an eye. Too normal. I asked him to check the file metadata. The timestamp jittered, skipping forward and back by fractions of a second, refusing to settle. Lisa muttered that it looked like compression artifacts. I knew better. I'd seen surveillance glitches before. This felt intentional, like the eyes were resisting being captured, as if whatever Marcus had seen didn't belong in a still frame. When the coroner gently closed the lids, The room seemed to exhale. The pressure eased. I hadn't realized how heavy it was until it lifted. I wrote in my notebook. Hands unsteady. Victim did not just watch something. Then, after a pause, I added, something watched him back. The second call came before Marcus was even buried. Then a third. By the end of the week, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Different companies, different buildings, same outcome. Private screening rooms, badge restricted, sealed environments, employees whose job titles blurred together, content strategist, acquisition analyst, programming lead, people paid to watch, judge, and decide what stories lived or died. Every room told the same quiet lie. Locked doors, clean floors, no signs of panic, no claw marks, no overturned chairs. Each victim was seated upright, eyes open, facing a dark screen. Timestamps showed marathon viewing sessions that shouldn't have been survivable. 48 hours, 60, 72. One security guard swore he'd heard movement inside a room he knew was empty, the low hum of equipment still running, like something refusing to power down. Autopsies stacked up, identical in their refusal to explain themselves. No trauma, no drugs, no cardiac event. The phrase undetermined cause began to feel less like a conclusion and more like an admission of defeat. I started carrying the case files home, spreading photos across my kitchen table at night. Different faces, same expression. That awful, reverent stillness. Lisa finally said what we were both thinking. This wasn't a killer. Killers leave signatures. This was closer to a process, a system doing what it was designed to do. And whatever it wasn't finished yet. E.T. handed the devices over like they were evidence from a fire scene. Wrapped, tagged, and handled with visible reluctance. At first glance, they looked like custom-built media players, the kind executives used for internal reviews. But the closer I looked, the harder it became to keep that explanation intact. The casing wasn't plastic or metal. It had texture, a dull, fibrous grain that resisted classification. When a tech sliced one open, the smell wasn't electrical. It was damp, earthy, like roots torn out of soil. Inside, the circuitry made my stomach tighten. Boards were threaded together with pale, corded strands that pulsed faintly when the power was connected. Veins, not wires. One engineer insisted it was some kind of bioorganic interface, experimental hardware he'd only heard about in theory. Another refused to touch it again after he felt heat under his glove. Rhythmic and subtle, like a slow heartbeat, when powered on. The screen didn't boot, it woke. A low hum filled the room, not from speakers, but from the device itself, vibrating through the table. No menus, no logos, just a waiting black field, as if it expected something to sit in front of it. I realized then these machines weren't built to display content. They were built to receive viewers. And for the first time since the case began, I felt certain the deaths weren't a malfunction. They were the machines doing exactly what they were made to do. We finally recovered a fragment, not footage, evidence of an image that didn't want to stay whole. A technician had snapped a photo of one screen seconds before it went dark. A reflex more than a decision. When we opened the file, the room fell quiet. The image was static, but not the random kind. It formed repeating bands, deliberate, layered as if someone had arranged chaos by hand. Lisa enhanced it frame by frame. That's when the shape emerged, a figure standing just left of center, barely distinguishable from the noise unless you knew where to look. A man in a narrow-cut suit, early 20th century by the lines of it, hat low, posture rigid. He wasn't blurred by motion. He was perfectly still. Too still. The longer we stared, the more details surfaced. Creases in the fabric, the suggestion of eyes beneath the brim. Not facing the camera. Facing us. I felt a prickling behind my eyes, like pressure building where thoughts form. The tech complained of a headache and left the room without saying anything. When we checked the raw data, the image wasn't there anymore. The file now showed ordinary static, meaningless and safe. But I knew what we'd seen. Noise doesn't arrange itself into men. Static doesn't watch back. Whatever appeared on those screens wasn't content. It was a presence, hiding inside interference, waiting patiently for someone to keep watching long enough for it to step forward. The break didn't come from the bodies. It came from the calendars. Lisa laid them out on the board. Conference schedules, RSVP lists, archived emails dug up from forgotten inboxes. At first, it looked like noise, the kind you get when you stare at enough data long enough. Then one name kept resurfacing. Quiet, but consistent. The Los Angeles Film Festival. All 5 victims had attended. Different days, different screenings. Same venue. A private showcase held in an old downtown theater scheduled for demolition. Temporarily resurrected for historical preservation. The festival specialized in lost films from the 1920s, titles with no surviving prints, no studio records, sometimes no proof they'd ever existed at all. That alone should have raised flags. Instead, it had been treated like a novelty. We pulled the attendee photos. The victims looked normal enough, smiling, holding drinks, standing in front of yellowed posters. But the longer I stared, the more wrong the images felt. The lighting didn't match. Shadows leaned the wrong way, and in several shots. Someone stood just out of focus behind them, always cropped awkwardly, always half missing from the frame. The festival had done what killers usually do. It brought them together first. Whatever happened in those screening rooms didn't begin there. It started weeks earlier, in a dark theater, with forgotten films flickering back to life, and an audience that didn't realize it was being chosen. The festival organizer's name sat at the bottom of every flyer in thin, decorative print. William Whitmore. No bio. No social footprint. No recent business filings. That alone was strange, but not impossible. Plenty of people in this city preferred to stay invisible. What unsettled me was how hard it was to find anything about him at all, like the past kept sliding off his name. The photo came from an archive box, mislabeled and forgotten in a municipal records room. Black and white, slightly warped at the edges. It showed Whitmore standing on a dusty hillside, one hand in his coat pocket, the other resting casually at his side. Behind him rose the original Hollywood land sign, intact, unweathered. The dating stamp placed the photograph sometime in the late 1920s. Whitmore looked exactly like the man in the static. Same narrow face, same posture, same unreadable calm. He wasn't smiling, but he didn't look serious either. He looked patient. I felt an odd chill when I realized he wasn't posing for the camera. He was aware of it. Yes, but his attention seemed directed somewhere beyond the lens, as if he knew who would be studying the image decades later. Lisa asked the obvious question. What if this isn't a coincidence? I didn't answer. I couldn't stop staring at the photograph, at a man who should have aged, should have died, should have stayed in his century. Instead, he'd been waiting, perfectly framed, for us to finally notice him. Once we accepted that William Whitmore was real, the rest of the case began to rot around the edges. Every attempt to place him in a timeline failed. Birth records returned near matches that collapsed under scrutiny. Census data contradicted itself. One archivist swore she'd seen his name in a studio ledger from the early sound era, then called back an hour later to say the page was blank. Not torn out. Blank. As if the ink had decided not to exist anymore. The more we looked, the more Whitmore seemed to slip. Old photographs degraded faster than they should. Digital scans produced artifacts that hadn't been there before, in one image. His face blurred while everything around him stayed sharp, like time itself refused to render him properly. It felt less like he was hiding, and more like history didn't know how to hold him. I started having the same thought over and over. What if he never left? Not survived. Persisted. As if he'd found a way to stand between moments, untouched by the forward motion that drags the rest of us along. A man unbound by decades, stepping effortlessly from silent film to streaming era without changing clothes. Late one night, I realized something worse. Every trace of Whitmore stopped just short of the present. No recent photos, no current sightings. Almost like he didn't need to be seen anymore. Like he'd already moved on to another role. One that didn't require him to stay in the past at all. Jennifer Park was supposed to be the sixth body. That's how the call came in. Unresponsive female. Possible overdose. Media executive. By the time we reached her apartment, the paramedics were already backing away, speaking in low voices like they'd wandered into the wrong room. Jennifer sat on her couch, spine rigid, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes were open, unblinking, fixed on the television across from her. She was breathing. Slow. Shallow. Alive in the most technical sense of the word. The screen played a black and white film on an endless loop. No sound. No subtitles. Just images of Los Angeles rendered wrong. Modern buildings dressed in shadows from a century ago. Cars moving like they were being dragged through syrup. The camera drifted through familiar streets as if it didn't recognize them anymore. Jennifer didn't react when I spoke her name. Didn't flinch when Lisa waved a hand inches from her face. Medical scans later showed her brain activity hovering at a strange plateau. Neither conscious nor unconscious. The doctor said it was like she'd gone somewhere and forgotten how to come back. I stood in that apartment long after the screen went dark, staring at the empty reflection. Jennifer wasn't watching television. She was attending something. And whatever it was, it had decided she was worth keeping. We watched the film in a controlled room, lights low, sound off by necessity rather than choice. There was never any audio to begin with. The footage stuttered at first, as if unsure it was being observed, then settled into a steady rhythm. Los Angeles appeared as a ghost of itself. Skyscrapers loomed like unfinished ideas. Streets bent at angles I recognized, but couldn't name. Everything was familiar in the way dreams borrow from memory, without asking permission. The camera floated, never handheld, never fixed. It glided, passing storefronts that no longer existed and others that hadn't been built yet. Pedestrians moved through the frame without faces, their features blurred into pale smudges, as if identity hadn't been fully rendered. Title cards appeared intermittently, written in an ornate, outdated font. They didn't explain anything. They commented, describing scenes that hadn't happened yet. Then the film cut to an interior, a police bullpen. Our bullpen. The desks were arranged exactly as they were that morning. I saw myself at my desk, head down, writing notes I hadn't written yet. The image flickered, corrected itself, and moved on. No one spoke. No one breathed. The room felt tighter with every frame. This wasn't archival footage. It wasn't predictive modeling. It was observation, quiet, patient, and absolutely certain we would keep watching until it finished telling us who we were. The moment the film acknowledged us, the room changed. It wasn't dramatic, no jump cut, no title card announcing the trick. The camera simply drifted closer to the bullpen until my own face filled the frame. Not a mirror image, an angle I couldn't have seen from where I'd been sitting. My movements were delayed by a fraction of a second, like reality was waiting for permission to continue. Lisa said my name. The version of her on screen did the same. Lips forming the words in perfect silence. I felt my pulse climb, a dull thudding in my ears, as if my body recognized itself as footage. The film advanced to moments that hadn't happened yet, us standing in a hallway we didn't recognize, a door we hadn't opened, a look on Lisa's face I'd never seen before, tight with understanding and something close to regret. The final sequence slowed almost to stillness. A title card appeared, trembling slightly at the edges. Every story resists its ending. Beneath it, a location burned into the frame, letters scratching themselves into place like they hurt to exist. Studio 13. The screen went black. No credits, no resolution, just our reflections staring back, pale and distorted. In that silence, I understood the most terrifying part wasn't that the film knew us. It was that it expected us to follow. And somewhere deep down, past reason and fear, I knew we already were. We tried to treat this film like evidence, freeze-framing it, cataloging shots, pinning timestamps to moments that refused to stay still. The more we analyzed, the less stable our present became. Scenes we'd already watched began to echo into the day. A coffee cup shattering in the bullpen exactly as it had on screen. A patrol car stalling in the same intersection. At the same angle. Smoke curling from the hood like a rehearsed effect. Coincidences, Lisa said, but her voice lacked conviction. By the second viewing, the film had changed. Not drastically, just enough to be unmistakable. A hallway was longer. A door appeared where there hadn't been one before. I felt a tightening in my gut as I realized the footage was updating, adjusting itself to match choices we hadn't made yet. It wasn't predicting the future. It was waiting for it. Like a script confident the actors would hit their marks. I stopped taking notes after I saw my handwriting appear on screen before I'd written it. The same cramped letters. The same hesitation in the pen stroke. That was when it clicked. The film didn't show what would happen no matter what. It showed what would happen if we kept watching. Every frame felt like an invitation dressed up as inevitability. And the more attention we gave it, the narrower our options became. Until reality itself started to feel like a scene already locked in the edit. The name surfaced quietly, the way dangerous things often do. No dramatic reveal, no hidden message glowing on the screen. It appeared in a corner of the film, etched into the background of a shot we'd already seen twice. A door frame, peeling paint, and beneath it, barely legible unless you paused at the right fraction of a second. Studio 13. At first we assumed it was set dressing, a historical detail borrowed from some forgotten lot. But the more we searched, the more the name resisted us. There were records of Studios 1 through 12, defunct sound stages, demolished buildings, repurposed warehouses. 13 didn't exist. Not officially. No permits, no blueprints, no photographs that stayed intact longer than a few minutes on screen. That bothered me more than if it had been classified. Things that are erased leave scars. This left nothing, as if the city itself had agreed not to remember it. When I replayed the clip again, the letters looked deeper, carved rather than painted. The shadows inside them didn't behave correctly, stretching too far, pulling inward. Lisa said the number made her uneasy. 13 wasn't unlucky in the usual way. It was deliberate, intentional, a choice. I wrote the name in my notebook and immediately crossed it out, then rewrote it, afraid of losing it somehow. The film had given us a destination, not as a clue, but as a certainty. Whatever Studio 13 was, it wasn't just a place, it was a boundary, and the film had just told us we were getting close. The closer we got to the hills, the stronger the sensation became. Not fear exactly, but pressure. Like altitude sickness without the height. The old Hollywood land sign loomed above us, stripped of its original promise. Just letters now. Sun-bleached and indifferent. I'd driven past it 100 times in my career. I'd never felt it looking back before. We parked where the road gave up and continued on foot. The film's final frame replayed in my head, overlaid on the landscape until it was hard to tell which version I trusted more. Halfway up the trail, my phone lost signal, then restarted on its own. Lisa's watch froze at 11:59 and refused to roll over. Time felt sticky, resisting forward motion. The pull wasn't directional. It came from beneath us, from the ground itself. Each step closer made my ears ring. A low hum like distant machinery spooling up. I realized with a jolt that it matched the sound from the organic players, the same waiting vibration. Near the base of the sign, the air warped, not visibly, not cleanly. Just enough that depth stopped making sense. Rocks seemed closer than they were. Shadows bent inward. I felt an irrational certainty settle in my chest. Something was below, and it knew we were standing on top of it. Lisa stopped. She didn't need to say anything. We both understood the same thing at once. Studio 13 wasn't hidden in the hills, it was folded into them. And whatever lived there wasn't calling us by name. It was calling us by role. The distortion didn't announce itself. There was no doorway, no threshold that felt official. One step, we were standing on solid ground. The next, the world seemed to hesitate, like a frame stuck between reels. My vision doubled, then corrected. But the correction felt wrong. Forced. The air thickened, pressing against my skin with a faint electrical warmth that made every hair on my arms lift. I took another step and felt resistance, not physical, not quite, more like walking into a memory that didn't belong to me. The ground dipped sharply, folding inward, and for a moment gravity lost interest. My stomach lurched, as if we'd missed a stair that wasn't there. Lisa swore under her breath, her voice stretching slightly, the sound arriving a fraction of a second late. Light behaved strangely inside the distortion. Shadows detached from their sources, lagging behind like tired extras. Colors drained, then returned too sharply, oversaturated, as if reality had overcorrected its settings. I smelled dust, old film stock, something chemical and sweet that reminded me of forgotten theaters. Behind us, the hillside looked flat, harmless, normal. Ahead, depth unraveled. Space compressed and expanded at the same time. A corridor made of overlapping moments. My watch began ticking too fast, then too slow, then stopped altogether. I realized with a cold certainty that we hadn't found Studio 13. We had stepped into the cut between scenes, and whatever existed here was not designed for people to pass through intact. Inside the distortion, Los Angeles refused to choose a year. Streets overlapped like transparencies, stacked out of order. A Model T idled beside a hybrid sedan, both waiting at a traffic light that flickered between Guy's lamp and LED. Buildings rose and collapsed in slow motion, brick bleeding into glass. Neon signs ghosting through Art Deco facades. I could hear music without sound, jazz rhythms tapping against synth bass, radio static braided with podcasts I recognized from last week. People passed us without seeing us, or maybe they saw different versions. A woman in a cloche hat brushed by, her shoulder phasing through Lisa's coat. A courier on an e-bike vanished mid-pedal, replaced by a newsboy hawking papers that dissolved into headlines before I could read them. Every face felt borrowed, like extras pulled from a casting call that spanned a century. Time didn't move forward here. It layered. Moments repeated at different speeds, some stuttering, others looping with minor edits. I watched a man step out of a theater 3 times, first in black and white, then in color, then in a washed-out digital grain, each exit ending with the same glance upward, as if he sensed us watching from between frames. My head throbbed with competing presence. Memory intruded where it shouldn't. Scenes from my own life intercut with events that hadn't happened yet. I understood then that this place wasn't chaos. It was an archive, playing everything at once, a city rendered as footage, endlessly spliced, and we were standing in the timeline's blind spot, where past and future bled together and called it now. The longer we stood there, the clearer it became that nothing around us was solid in the way I understood solidity. Edges shimmered, not from heat, but from indecision, like the world couldn't agree on which version of itself to present. When I focused on a single detail, a crack in the sidewalk, a flickering sign, it sharpened, stabilized, while everything else softened, blurred, waiting its turn. Attention acted like an editor's hand. Lisa reached out and touched a wall. Her fingers passed through the first inch, then met resistance, as if the surface hadn't finished loading. When she pulled back, her hand left a faint afterimage, a translucent echo that snapped into place a second later. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. This wasn't space. It was a sequence. I noticed faint markers everywhere once I knew to look for them. Invisible cuts where motion jumped, repeating extras, background events looping with slight variations, like alternate takes. Even us, our movements felt fractionally delayed, as if we were being rendered a beat behind intention. I had the disturbing realization that if someone stopped paying attention to us, we might simply drop out of frame. This place didn't obey physics because it wasn't built on them. It obeyed continuity. Cause and effect existed only if the edit supported it. Reality here wasn't happening. It was being played, and somewhere beyond what we could see, something was watching the timeline scroll past, deciding which moments were worth keeping and which ones could be cut without anyone noticing they were gone. Whitmore spoke as if he were continuing a conversation we'd interrupted decades ago. His voice didn't echo, didn't carry. It arrived directly, bypassing the space between us. He said cinema was never meant to entertain. That was a side effect, a convenient disguise. Its real function, discovered by accident in the early days, was alignment, synchronization, teaching reality how to behave by showing it what people expected to see. In 1923, he said, they learned the trick. 24 still images a second, arranged just right, could convince the human mind that motion existed where it didn't. Reality, it turned out, was just as suggestible. Show it a version of itself often enough, from enough angles, and it would begin to comply. Streets straightened, myths hardened into history. Dreams learned how to repeat themselves. Los Angeles wasn't built. It was edited. Every film, every broadcast, every piece of content fed the same underlying mechanism, reinforcing the idea that this was how the city moved, how it breathed, how it changed. Whitmore smiled, not kindly, but with satisfaction. He said people thought cameras captured truth. What they really captured was permission. I felt a sick recognition settle in. All those screening rooms, all those viewers, they hadn't been watching stories. They'd been tuning themselves to the signal. Cinema wasn't reflecting the world anymore. It was instructing it. And Studio 13 existed to make sure the instructions stayed consistent. No matter how many lives had to be quietly rewritten to keep the picture stable. Whitmore knelt and pressed his palm against the floor, as if feeling for a pulse. He told us the secret was never the image itself, but the gap between images. That sliver of nothing, 1/24th of a second, where the mind stitched motion out of absence. Persistence of vision, he called it. A flaw in perception that became a doorway. In that gap, time loosened. History stopped behaving like a line and started acting like raw footage. Frames that could be rearranged, trimmed, or repeated without anyone noticing the seam. Studio 13 lived there, he said. Not fully in any year, but in the interval that all years passed through. That was why it couldn't be found on a map. Maps only tracked what stayed put. He gestured, and the air rippled. I saw moments flash by, streetcars turning into buses, film reels dissolving into servers, faces aging backward and forward in quick, nauseating cuts. Whitmore said most people pass through these gaps every day without feeling a thing. But some learned how to linger, how to stretch the pause long enough to step inside. That was what the films were doing, slowing the viewer down, holding them in the space between frames until their sense of sequence unraveled. Some minds couldn't survive it. They froze, suspended in that perfect, awful stillness. Others, like Jennifer Park, slipped deeper, becoming part of the mechanism itself. Whitmore looked at us carefully then. He said we'd already crossed over. The only question left was whether we understood what it meant to live in the pause, or if we were still pretending we could go back to the story as it used to be. Whitmore straightened slowly, and for the first time I saw fatigue in him, layered deep, like film worn thin by too many passes through a projector. He told us Los Angeles wasn't a place in the way other cities were. It was infrastructure, a machine built to convert desire into narrative, narrative into belief, belief into permanence. Every dream brought here added torque, every story tightened a gear. The studios weren't symbols, they were components, lenses, regulators, pressure valves. When one failed, the output warped, people disappearing, memories misaligning, lives cutting abruptly to black. Studio 13 existed to stabilize the flow, to prevent the city from collapsing into unfiltered story, where anything imagined could manifest without restraint. Chaos, he said, wasn't dramatic. It was incoherent, and incoherence destroyed the machine. I felt the city around us then, not as streets or buildings, but as rhythm, a constant hum, cycling at a familiar rate, 24 pulses a second, the frame rate, the heartbeat. Whitmore said if it ever dropped, even briefly, reality would stutter. If it stopped, the city would forget what it was supposed to be. That was why the viewers mattered, why the deaths happened quietly, without struggle. The machine required witnesses, not victims. Attention was the fuel. And as he looked at us, eyes reflecting endless edits, I understood the truth he hadn't said out loud. The machine didn't care who operated it, only that someone always did. Whitmore led us deeper, past walls that shifted like overlapping exposures, until the space opened into something resembling a control room stripped of spectacle. No glowing panels, no grand machinery, just a ring of apertures suspended in the air. each one humming at a slightly different pitch. 13 of them, though only one was fully in focus. The others wavered, blurred, as if waiting for calibration. He called them lenses, not metaphors, tools. Each lens gathered a specific kind of story and bent it into alignment with the city's core narrative. Romance softened the edges. Horror vented excess fear. Comedy released pressure through laughter. Documentary anchored everything to something resembling truth. Genres weren't categories. They were stabilizers. When one lens drifted out of sync, reality near it began to smear. Whitmore showed us fragments, a neighborhood trapped in a looping tragedy, reliving the same disaster with minor variations. A man who woke each morning in a different version of his own life. A block where every love story ended mid-sentence. These weren't accidents. They were focus errors. Studio 13 handled convergence, the place where genres overlapped, where the city decided what kind of story it was telling about itself at any given moment. Whitmore's voice tightened when he said that part required constant adjustment. Too much fantasy and people forgot limits. Too much realism, and the dream collapsed. I stared at the lenses, listening to their combined hum settle into something disturbingly familiar. It sounded like Los Angeles at night. Traffic, electricity, breath. And I realized the city didn't just run on stories. It saw through them. The festival, Whitmore explained, had never been about nostalgia. The lost films were prototypes, rough cuts meant to see how modern minds reacted to older frequencies. Each screening was a calibration test. Who could sit through the distortions? Who leaned forward instead of away? Who kept watching after the image began to push back? The victims hadn't been chosen at random. They were curators, gatekeepers, people trained to decide what deserved attention. Their tolerance for ambiguity was higher. Their instinct to keep watching was professional, almost reflexive. Whitmore said the films slowed time around them, stretching the space between frames just enough to see who dissolved and who held their shape. Most didn't. They froze at the threshold, minds locked in rapture as their bodies shut down, attention trapped in an endless present. Efficient, he called it. Minimal disruption. Their deaths fed data back into the system, refining the lenses. Jennifer Park had been different. She adapted. Her mind found a rhythm inside the distortion, learning to drift without breaking. That made her valuable, a living sensor embedded in the process. Whitmore said she could be retrieved. Eventually, if the machine remained stable. I felt anger flare, sharp and useless. He spoke about lives the way editors talk about scenes that don't make the final cut. But beneath his calm, I sensed something brittle. These tests weren't just about improvement. They were about replacement. And as the screenings grew more precise, fewer people were needed to keep the machine running, including him. Whitmore led us to the center of Studio 13, where the space narrowed into a single, deliberate point. There was no screen, no projector, just a wide editing bay carved into the distortion itself. Timelines floated in the air like pale scars, branching, overlapping, constantly rearranging. I could feel them more than see them, lives spooling forward, backward, sideways, waiting to be trimmed. This is the final edit, Whitmore said. Not a conclusion, but a balance. He explained that every story the city told about itself passed through here eventually. What stayed became history. What was cut dissolved quietly, leaving behind gaps no one questioned. The viewers had seen it all at once, the infinite version of Los Angeles, every possible cut layered together. Their minds locked because no one was meant to hold that much continuity. He showed us what happened when the edit failed. Streets duplicated, People remembered deaths that never occurred. Entire weeks vanished from the city's memory, replaced by montages that felt real enough to pass. Chaos wasn't loud. It was subtle. A city losing confidence in its own sequence. Whitmore's hands trembled as he stepped away from the controls. He'd been here too long, stretched thin across too many frames. He said the machine didn't need a creator anymore. It needed caretakers, editors willing to decide what reality could afford to keep. As the timelines shifted toward us, I understood the truth beneath his words. The final edit was never finished. It was a position. And now, whether we accepted it or not, the cut was all ready moving, reshaping the city with or without our consent. We told ourselves we were ending it, that whatever Whitmore had built could be broken the same way any machine could. Disconnect the power, shatter the core, walk away. The idea was comforting in its simplicity. I reached for the nearest control surface, my hand passing through layers of flickering timelines before making contact. The moment I touched it, the hum spiked, sharp and panicked, like something realizing too late it was about to be hurt. Lisa fired her weapon into one of the lenses. The sound didn't echo. It folded in on itself, repeating a fraction of a second later. Then again, until the air vibrated with overlapping reports. Cracks spidered across the distortion. Bright seams of white light tearing through overlapping eras. Streets bled into one another. Voices leaked in. Laugh tracks. Screams. Whispered dialogue, all playing at once. Studio 13 didn't collapse. It unraveled. Timelines snapped free, whipping past us in violent cuts. I saw lives abort mid-sentence, memories spliced incorrectly, people blinking as entire years vanished behind their eyes. The pressure became unbearable, like standing too close to an explosion made of stories instead of fire. Then Whitmore laughed, tired and broken. He shouted over the noise that we hadn't destroyed the machine. We'd removed the editor. What we were releasing wasn't silence. It was raw footage, and as the distortion tore itself open, I felt Los Angeles above us shudder, its rhythm falter, the frame rate slipping just enough to notice. The effects didn't arrive like a wave. They crept. By the time we reached the surface, the city already felt wrong in small, deniable ways. A man on the sidewalk argued into a phone that wasn't there. A digital billboard flickered between 3 different ads, each targeting a different decade. Traffic lights skipped cycles, holding green too long, then snapping red without warning, as if unsure which sequence they belonged to. Reports flooded in within hours, missing persons who technically hadn't existed yet. Burglaries caught on security footage that showed the suspect entering a building that had been demolished years ago. Witnesses described the same event with incompatible details. All of them convinced they were right. Doctors complained of patients remembering surgeries they never had scars for. The city felt overstimulated, like it had been forced to process too many drafts of itself at once. Reality glitched at the edges. Conversations looped. News segments replayed with altered phrasing. I caught myself rereading the same paragraph in a report, the words rearranging subtly each time, meaning intact, but unstable. Whitmore's absence was a wound, without an editor. Stories bled into one another unchecked. Genre boundaries collapsed. Tragedies picked up laugh tracks. Romantic moments ended abruptly, as if someone had cut away too soon. People sensed something was off, but couldn't agree on what. The worst part was the feeling beneath it all, a mounting pressure. Like the city was accelerating without a stabilizer. The frame rate hadn't stopped. It had slipped. And Los Angeles, stripped of continuity, was starting to improvise. Whitmore found us again in the wreckage, or what passed for it now, He looked thinner, stretched across overlapping moments, his outline flickering like a bad splice. Pieces of him lagged behind when he moved. He said this was what happened when you stayed in the cut too long without relief. You stopped being singular. This is why it can't be left empty, he told us, gesturing to the trembling space where Studio 13 had been. Raw narrative doesn't resolve itself. It metastasizes. His voice carried a note I hadn't heard before. Not fear, but exhaustion. A man finishing a shift that had lasted a century. He said the city needed editors, not creators, not gods. Custodians who understood restraint. People trained to recognize when a story had gone too far and when it needed to be let play out. The studios didn't require brilliance. They required judgment. And judgment, he said, came easiest to those who spent their lives sorting truth from testimony. Lisa asked what happened if we refused. Whitmore didn't answer directly. He just showed us a future frame. Los Angeles collapsing into pure narrative. Every belief briefly true. Nothing lasting long enough to matter. A city burning itself out on infinite possibility. When he finally looked at us, his eyes were steady. I'm done, he said. You're already here. The offer wasn't framed as a choice. It was framed as continuity. Someone had to sit in the chair. Someone had to keep the cut clean. And whether we accepted or not. The timeline was already adjusting around us, waiting for the edit to resume. We didn't shake hands. There was no ceremony, no moment that felt definitive enough to mark the change. We just stepped forward, and the space responded. The fractured timeline slowed, their frantic motion easing into something closer to rhythm. The chair, if it could be called that, resolved beneath us, assembling itself from intention more than matter. I felt a pressure at the base of my skull, not painful, just insistent, like a new sense waking up. Whitmore watched with something like relief. As we took position, pieces of him stabilized, then faded, shedding relevance frame by frame. He told us the role wasn't about control, it was about editing. Knowing when not to intervene, knowing which cuts would be noticed, and which would pass unseen. Absorbed as coincidence or bad memory, information poured in, not words, not images, but context. I could feel the city's pulse, 24 beats a second, each one carrying thousands of micro-decisions. Hold this moment, trim that one. Let this tragedy resolve naturally. Pull away before it spreads. Lisa's breathing synced with mine, our awareness overlapping without merging, like co-editors working the same reel. When we finally stood again, the chaos had dulled to background noise. The city above us steadied. Whitmore was gone. No farewell, just absence where a function used to be. I realized then the most dangerous part wasn't what we'd taken on. It was how quickly it already felt necessary. Stability didn't return on its own. It had to be assembled, choice by careful choice. Lisa and I learned quickly that 2 editors weren't enough. Studio 13 could hold the center, but the other lenses were still drifting, their signals noisy, unfocused. Genres bled where they shouldn't. Horror crept into the mundane. Comedy undercut grief at the wrong moment. The city needed specialists. We didn't recruit publicly. We watched. Writers who understood restraint. Directors who knew when to cut away. A documentarian who valued truth over impact. People who'd spent their lives shaping stories without needing to be seen inside them. When we reached out, none of them were surprised. They said it felt like remembering something they'd almost forgotten. Each new editor stabilized a lens. The hum smoothed out. Neighborhoods stopped repeating themselves. Lost time reattached cleanly, leaving behind only the faint discomfort people chalked up to stress or bad sleep. We built redundancies, fail-safes, rules about what could never be shown in full. The work was constant but quiet. No heroics, no credits. Just maintenance. I learned to feel when a story was pulling too hard on belief, when attention alone threatened to make it real. That's when we intervened, trimming just enough to let doubt survive. Los Angeles didn't notice the repair. Cities rarely do. They only notice collapse. And every night, as the frame rate held steady, I understood the system wasn't restored to what it had been. It was something leaner, wiser, built to endure us. By day, nothing changed. We still filed reports, chased leads, argued over bad coffee in the bullpen. The city presented itself as it always had, loud, fractured, endlessly confident in its own chaos. People blamed stress, algorithms, the news cycle. They never blamed the edit, which was exactly the point. At night, the work resumed. Studio 13 never slept. The timelines flowed steadily now. Not calm, but contained. We learned the texture of danger, the subtle tug when a story wanted too much attention, the vibration when belief threatened to harden into fact. Most corrections were small. A missed connection, a rumor that lost traction, a piece of footage corrupted just enough to be dismissed. Some nights I watched the city breathe, 24 pulses a second, and wondered how many lives depended on moments we'd quietly removed. I stopped counting. Editors can't afford nostalgia. The department closed the case. Equipment failures, workplace stress, a handful of sealed files no one wanted to reopen. Jennifer Park woke up 3 weeks later with no memory of the film, only a lingering sense that she'd been somewhere important and left something unfinished behind. Sometimes, when I catch my reflection in a dark screen, I see a flicker, an extra frame that doesn't belong. A reminder. The city is still a machine. It still runs on stories, and it will always try to exceed its limits. Our job isn't to stop that. It's to make sure this story keeps going. Clean cuts, stable frames, and just enough uncertainty left that people still believe their lives are their own.